Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Property Journey podcast. Good morning, Roy.
Morning, Chris.
Episode 5.
We're flying through them.
Flying through them. It's been a journey so far. I was actually sitting thinking on everything that we had talked about. From obviously the conveyance process, rental markets. Last episode was solicitor's role.
That's right.
And house prices as well. So we're getting through a good bit. And I feel I'm learning anyway.
You're becoming an expert.
Well, maybe not that much just yet, but we're certainly getting there. But today's topic, I wanted to discuss property investing. And obviously, this is from your own experience. It's not what we would describe as financial advice. We just wanted to give a brief overview on sort of the different topics, things to consider. And obviously, we've talked about it previously, where property investing is simply down to personal choice and personal preferences and how people go about it, whether it suits them or not, and those types of things. So I suppose the first question I wanted to ask was, why do people choose property as like an investment tool? And like, what are maybe the potential benefits to doing it?
Well, firstly, there's always seems to be this obsession with people, particularly Northern Irish people, where they want to own property, and there's just this magnet to it that if you own property, you're going to be a multi-millionaire, billionaire, which can be the case, but generally that comes with those who've spent many years investing and learning the tricks and the market. So I suppose investment is one of the many different types of investments that you can get into. And I suppose the main benefit of it is it's something that you can see. It's something that's a wee bit hands-on, and it can be quite fun as well. A lot of people maybe enjoy the getting to find tenants, getting to know tenants, maybe even getting the sleeves rolled up and getting stuck into renovating or painting a house. And if you do your due diligence right and you look and you get the right property, the figures definitely can stack up.
Because as you say there, a lot of people do seem to choose it as an area to go down. Now, obviously, I know a lot of younger people nowadays are struggling even to buy their first home, never mind trying to buy an investment property as such. And there's other ones out there that aren't struggling. And it's clearly, again, it just boils down to people's circumstances. But, is there any downside to property investing? Because obviously a lot of people would say there's a lot of benefits to it, but is there a downside to it as well?
Just like all investments, there's downsides to it. So with property, it's a market that's controlled. Sorry, not controlled, but it has its parameters, and it can go up, it can go down, and again, if you don't know what you're doing, you can very easily lose out.
And I suppose because you could reference probably the 2008 crash. Where a lot of people were buying property in the build up to that.
Yeah.
And they lost a lot of it.
Probably, well, yes, there was the financial impact on it, but ultimately on the ground, there was a lot of people buying property who had no knowledge of it. They were speculating. So too much speculation in a market, and that's what ultimately then it came crashing down.
So how important would location be when it comes to property investment? Because and I mean this even in you can obviously have a town or a city or that type of location, but within that area there's also prime locations, because there's prime residential locations, but there's also prime commercial, and we're going to get on to residential and commercial a bit later on. So how important would location be when considering property investment?
So important. We've talked about it before, just as location for buying a house to live in. It's the exact same for renting out. I've heard of mistakes from people in the past who just have this thought, I want to buy a house. They go and search and they pick the cheapest house out there and they think, oh sure, a tenant will live in it. That's not the case. It's like running a business. Your tenant is your customer. So you need to have a product that is going to attract the right customer for you. And the key thing is location. So you want to buy ultimately a house that is close to a town, close to schools, close to big major employers, so that there's plenty of tenants, plenty of demand there, and the tenants have access to schools, maybe able to walk to work if they don't drive. So location is very, very important.
And I suppose that'd be the same thing for commercial side of things as well. You want to be probably in an area with other businesses around you. their customers might be coming in. Therefore, if you're renting out a unit, a business wants to be in a prime location as well.
Yeah, well, the slight difference with commercial is for location, it's does it suit the needs? So for instance, if you're a packaging company or a warehouse company, well, you wouldn't rent in the middle of a town, whereas you'd want to be out in probably in an industrial estate where there's plenty of access, close to the main roads, motorways, things like that. Whereas for a property in the town, that's where maybe you need the footfall, you want the customers coming backwards and forwards. So the location is again very important for commercial, linked to the specific needs and style and type of the business.
And I suppose from an investor point of view, then you need to figure out kind of what sort of area that you want to move into. For an investor, you could very well go out and buy a warehouse unit. You know exactly what company you're going to be targeting with that warehouse unit. Whereas, as you say, with a footfall business that's mainly demanding customers to walk past the window and come in, that's going to be a slightly different investment tool. Therefore, you need to consider what businesses would potentially want to target you.
Yeah, it's all about what you're sitting down. What is your strategy? What type of tenant do you want? What type of building are you going to buy to suit that tenant? What sort of returns are you going to get? So
and obviously, is there property investment strategies? And I could ramble on here and say that there's a lot of videos out here on the internet where people are property investment and all these different schemes they've come up with and strategies and how they do it and how they finance it and everything and everyone, personally I always say if it was that easy, everyone would be doing it. So is there what you would describe as investment strategies out there? I know there's different things like buy-to-lets and flipping and that side of things. So is there any strategies that you kind of know of? Or
there's quite a few strategies. In fact, there's quite a lot that I wouldn't be able to go in today in them all, but it basically comes down to is peeling it back, and I keep saying it from the start of this podcast here, what is the strategy that the client wants or you as an investor? How much money do you want to put in? How much involvement do you want? And what's your view on risk? By all means, you only have to start scrolling social media and type in property, and within minutes your news feed is just going to be completely inundated with all these videos, as you say, from people all over the UK and all over the world, who make it just look so easy. But I suppose one of the reasons why they make it look so easy, well, there's two reasons. One is they're just trying to sell you a package to make money, or second of all, they have spent years upon years investing, trial, error, and they're just looking to again probably sell a package to you. So it's be very cautious. I've spent years researching quite a few different strategies, and I've trialed them myself very cautiously, but be very cautious as yourself. I have clients, one actually booked in this afternoon with me who wants to now invest in property. So I'm going to sit down with her and I'm going to go through, as I say, how much money has she to invest, what's her view on risk, and how much involvement does she want to get into it. And we'll sit down, we'll work it out, and I'm going to be giving her the knowledge of a local market and how that'll fit in with her strategy. Whereas watching those programs and videos from throughout the UK doesn't particularly necessarily suit Northern Ireland.
I know, because we actually had that conversation. I think it was in the House Prices podcast episode. I think it was episode 3, where we discussed that Northern Ireland's its own market, and you have to be very careful on making sure that you're reading
the data and just that it suits Northern Ireland. We're very unique. We're very unique.
Because I was actually listening to the radio, and this is slightly off topic, but I was listening to the radio and the big headline was it's now cheaper to rent than it is to buy. And I'm sitting thinking to myself, that how is that even possible? And then I went in and actually checked out the figures, and that's not the case for Northern Ireland. So I was listening to the news, I heard this big headline, it's now cheaper to rent than it is to buy, but when you actually go in and read the figures, in Northern Ireland, it's still cheaper on average to buy than it is to rent. And very easily people could just take that in and kind of go, there it is, it's now cheaper to rent. It's
all about, the media and the news. Sometimes just don't pay full attention to it. Like, again, the flip side to that, this morning, Halifax is now coming out and they've commented that it's now actually more affordable to buy a house now compared to a couple of years ago. So basically, how I read that is that's the banks trying to encourage people to really get stuck in now, start to buy a property.
Yeah. Back to the strategies actually, and as I was saying, like buy to let. So essentially, as buy to let, you buy a property, your ultimate aim is to rent that out then. So you become essentially a landlord. On the flipping side of things, because it's going to lead on to my next question, is that essentially where you buy a property, do it up, and then immediately want to sell it once it's market ready as such?
Yeah, so the strategy there is you look around and you buy a property that maybe needs work done to it, or so in some way that you can add value to it, which could be maybe just a refurb of it, maybe it's an extension, change of use, those sorts of things. So yes, you buy it, you go in, you do whatever work it is to enhance the value of it, and then you put it back on the market again and you sell it, and that's where the term flipping comes from.
Because I know you could obviously say a lot of people, what they do is they maybe go in and buy a big house that's maybe 4 or 5 bedrooms or whatever, and they turn it into 4 or 5 mini apartments. And then obviously that's added value. Each apartment's then sold off, bang, away they go.
Yes.
On to the next project. Because that leads me on to auctions and property auctions then. And they're becoming slightly more common. I know they've always been around. You could have woke up on a Saturday morning, watched Homes Under the Hammer, and I was actually glued to it, which is strangely enough. But you've seen auctions and stuff, but like how do they work?
So auctions have probably come around after 2000, 2008. They've started to become more and more popular in Northern Ireland, and without doing much research into property, people think, oh, I'll buy a house at an auction, it's going to be cheaper, and then you'll be able to do the work to it and then flip it. That's not always the case. Auction houses sell a complete range of houses. They could be somebody that is just genuinely wanting to sell, but they want to sell a wee bit faster and they can't be bothered with viewings and things like that. It might be the case that there could be maybe title issues with the property. It might be the case that it's a repossession from the bank. So there's a whole range of different types of properties that you'll find at an auction. So the auction house will then advertise the list of properties, and they'll normally give a guide price, and that's the guide price of just maybe a starting price of where it's going to go to. Maybe some people get a wee bit delusioned and a wee bit sidetracked because they think, oh, that's what the house is going to be selling for. But that's just really to spark interest and to get going. An auction then goes live and basically everybody puts their bid in. And the big difference between an auction and buying through an estate agent is as soon as the hammer goes down effectively, or the auction ends in the auction, that's it. It's your house. You're committed to buying it.
Yeah.
Whereas buying it through an estate agent, at that point when your offer is accepted, that's, you're only now going through the legal process. Whereas, as I say, with an auction, as soon as it's ended, you better hand over the money.
Yeah. And I suppose because the other thing I wanted to touch on was there's reserve prices as well. So you can go into an auction, from what I gather anyway, and put a bid in for a property. No one else has bid on it. You think you've got it for an unbelievably cheap price.
Yeah.
But there is a reserve price on it.
Yeah. So let's say, for instance, I put a property in, and to me as a seller, I think it's worth a minimum of 100,000. I don't want to go for any less than that. It maybe starts off at 75,000. If it bids up, but it only hits 95,000, well then at that point then it hasn't hit my minimum reserve. So but it's very similar to, no doubt, a lot of people have bought on eBay and such other online auctions. So it's a similar concept.
But like there obviously has to be, you can pick a good deal up at them, clearly, because they wouldn't be still going if you couldn't.
Yep, there's options there, because again, sometimes with auctions you need to buy with cash. You're not able to buy with mortgage. That's another thing as well, because you have to buy so quickly. You can't be then looking around for a mortgage, because to get a mortgage could take 6, 8, 10 weeks.
Yeah.
Whereas with an auction, you've got normally 4 weeks to hand over the money. So for that reason, yes, that sometimes can get you a better house.
And like, would you know any common mistakes that investors could make? Like, it's obviously quite difficult because everyone, and we keep saying it, everyone's circumstances is different, everyone's needs is different. But is there like a common thread of mistakes that some people can make?
Two, and just to very simply summarize it, people think it's easy, and they basically have an attitude which is it'll not happen to me scenario. So making it easy, for instance, to go into that means to just think I'll just go out and pick a house and it'll rent, and that's simple. And then they think it, have a blasé approach to risk, whereas they just think, oh yes, sure, I'll put a wee advert on social media and I'll get a tenant, and they sound lovely. They're hitting all the buzzwords, which always amazes me. When you're doing viewings and you're doing it time and time again, you hear the same repeat questions again, or answers, which are, I'm a long-term tenant, this is close to my family, I've got OCD and I'm really obsessed with cleaning, and my family lives around the corner, this is ideal for me, and I'm leaving my house because there's damp in it. And that's always the same things that you're hearing time and time again. But if you drill down into those applications, you'll probably see a more true reason on it. So if you don't know that information and you haven't come across it, you very simply maybe take the first tenant that comes along. So effectively, that tenant is picking you, whereas you're not picking them. Yeah. And if things go horribly wrong, you don't have your paperwork lined up, you don't have your due diligence done on the tenant, it can be very, very, very costly. And
because and especially now in current times, you should nearly have an abundance of people that are looking for a rental property, because of the way that the market is. So you shouldn't really be picking the first one, because you should actually have a decent list of applicants as such that are coming in, that you can kind of review everyone and do it properly, rather than kind of grasping at straws and I need the first person in to be able to start making money.
Easily give you an example, property that was listed there last Wednesday, and there was about 45 requests in within a couple of days, and that was narrowed down to about 10 viewings at the weekend, and those 10 then will probably be narrowed down to 2. So that's whenever you go through those processes, just to keep narrowing it down. It's like a funnel, just but if you pick the wrong one at the start, it's costly. And clearly, and you can understand that as well, because obviously the tenant wants to find, or the landlord wants to find the right tenant, and clearly everyone it's back to the same thing. Everyone's got their own needs, everyone's got their own, way of doing things, therefore that's how they manage to get the right people into the right properties as such. Group investing, is there such a thing as group investing? Because sometimes you hear of it where, it's nearly like a consortium as such of people come together and they invest as a group. Is there such a thing? Is there different types of it? That's it's known as group investment, consortium investment, or also joint ventures. So there could be times where maybe one person has a bit more money to invest, but they don't want the hassle and they don't want to get involved, and they partner up with somebody who wants to do all the legwork and all the running about. So you can work out a deal or a split on a transaction. Or maybe for big ventures, you can pull together 5, 6, 7 investors. I've come across that very regularly, where basically you pull together those 5 investments, you have a pot of money, and then one person then manages it and controls it, and basically like a mini hedge fund as such. And with that, you could pull together, easily you could pull together £1 million plus. And then that allows you to then go out and buy those maybe bigger properties, bigger commercial properties, and they ultimately can give you better returns. So it is something that people could look into if they're heavily geared just for a return. And if they go out and do it alone, they maybe only have, for instance, 100,000 to invest, 100,000 to buy a house, might only bring them 6-7% return. Whereas if that was pulled together, I've come across it and seen it where it could generate 12% plus.
And is that a case of essentially, and this is me probably going to go very vaguely here, if you've 100,000 and someone else has invested 200,000 and someone else has invested 300,000, that's obviously whatever profits made, you're getting essentially a share split, based on what you've invested. So if you've invested 100,000 but there's 600 in the pot, you're getting a sixth.
Generally, and very simple working out. Generally, you put a contract in place between all the investors and basically like a set of rules, which basically means, you know, this is how much everybody's putting into it. This is the strategy that they're going down, and then these are probably the exit strategies as well for the properties, as in maybe to sell them off, and then ultimately exit strategies for each investor as well to get out of that consortium.
And then probably what their return is
as
expected
well.
to be then,
And then,
you know, when they exit. Because that's, I mean, you hear these things and you don't actually know if they're common or not, if they're, you know, people are actually doing it day to day. Sometimes a lot of people think to themselves that that's just for rich people, you know what I mean? Because it's on a, you hear it on a bigger scale rather than, you know, actually, you know what, we've got quite a decent group of investors here we can pull together and actually maybe start to do some of these things. Sometimes you just don't think that it's possible as such.
But there's funds out there, and there's different schemes, online platforms, which you could simply invest as little as maybe £100 or £1,000 into it. So you had mentioned there that investing's only for the rich. To me, everybody should invest and save money. I'm a big advocate of saving money, investing money. So even if you only have a spare few £100, that should be saved or invested in some way.
Yeah. We've obviously talked there about due diligence as well, because a lot of this is obviously going to boil down to making sure you're making the right decision. You know, you hear some horror stories where some people have invested in a property, they haven't done their due diligence, they haven't realised that the property's essentially about to fall to the ground. You know, so is it a case of you're nearly doing the same due diligence as what you would be if you were to buy your own home?
Generally, yes. Maybe a wee bit more detailed in that with your new home, you're buying something that's suiting you to live in and all your needs and locally and style and things like that. Whereas for an investment property, yes, those things are important, but likewise, it would be good to bring in a local expert. So whether that means you're bringing in, there's people out there that source properties. So yes, you pay them a fee, but they will source you a property. They'll do all the viewings and the hunting out for you, which will cut out a whole pile of time for you. And so that's the property sourcer. Then you speak to your property manager, because you want to know what's it going to rent for, how much fees are they going to be charging, what's your overall return on the investment. And then you start getting into the other similarities to a home buyer, which is the finance side of things and your surveys.
Because obviously I was probably more thinking on a survey aspect. Like, you know, you obviously don't want to be buying a building and clearly there's maybe severe issues with it structurally, and now you're sitting with this building that you need to do a hell of a lot of work to. But it's actually interesting about property sourcing. Like, there is people obviously clearly in a local area that obviously maybe have grew up there, understand the area, maybe lived in it for 20 years. They understand what buildings or what properties are sought after, what areas are sought after, and they can advise you on that front.
Like any expert, they're dealing day in, day out. They're constantly seeing what's for sale. They're constantly viewing properties. They know what properties are selling for. So, they're...
And I suppose it's probably boils back down to, I want to buy this property. Well, look, it's been bought and sold 4 times in the last 5 years. You'd start to question why. You know, that if people are obviously buying it and selling it, there's clearly either an issue there, they're possibly tenants, they can't get tenants for it.
Get tenants, maybe there's an issue with the house, maybe, you know, issue with title and rights of way and things like that. So a number of reasons. And
again, I don't want to get maybe too bogged down into it, but like, is there tax implications, you know, that if you're interested in investing in property, residential, commercial, either or, is there tax implications that people should think of? Is it like a second income potentially?
Different tax, it all depends which way you go. For instance, commercial or residential. There's so many ways here that we could talk all day, for instance, about it, but very briefly, if you're buying a property just in your own name, then there is tax involved in that. And if you're a lower tax bracket or higher tax bracket, that has an impact. Or you can set up a limited company, which can have tax benefits for you. And then commercial premises as well. There's different tax implications and savings, whether you're buying maybe through your pension, or just buying through a limited company. So again, it all comes down to if you're sitting down with an expert, working out what your strategy is in investment, how much return you want, and then likewise you put in the tax benefits as well.
I know, because yeah, I'm actually just thinking that you could obviously buy a property, you have someone that's renting it out, you think you're going to be making money, but actually by the time you take out the cost of maybe your mortgage, if you've got a mortgage on it or not, and then maybe by the time you take out the tax and all that, you might actually be sitting with nothing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So clearly do your
homework
research
at the start.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And obviously, is there pros and cons to the clearly, and I do think we've touched on this before. I think you've actually done a video on it. Pros and cons to commercial. Is there pros and cons, obviously, to residential as well? You know, for people to sort of choose what route to go down.
Very quickly to summarize, there's different pros and cons of it in no particular order. With commercial, up to a particular level, you can save on stamp duty compared to residential. As I touched on earlier, commercial, you could maybe buy it through your pension, which is a very tax efficient way. Commercial, in theory, a property should rent out and the tenant should stay longer. But then the flip side to it is it takes longer to find a tenant.
Yeah.
So then you're losing that money for the time that it's vacant. And then with the residential, generally if a tenant moves out, freshen up the house and it's rented again within a week. So it can be a very, very fast turnaround of it. But then the returns can be a wee bit lower for residential compared to commercial.
And that actually brings it on to sort of like rental income from an investor, obviously, point of view. And I think we touched on this in the rental market episode where, is it similar to what a landlord kind of chooses or wants? Does it boil back down to what their needs are? Are they wanting to maximize profits, or are they wanting to have an easy life, have a nice steady passive income coming in, and they have a lovely tenant who stayed in the house now for the last 10 years?
Mm-hmm.
Is that kind of the similar situation with a rental income?
Would be like all investments. The higher degree of risk that you're willing to take on, the higher the return, but then also the higher the risk of you losing money on it. So yes, if it could be viewed that if you buy a house and you rent it out at a fair price and you get a good tenant, well, it's fairly straightforward. But all you're doing is there's still a risk.
Yeah.
Still a risk, like all investment. It's just what you've done there is you've reduced it down you've mitigated it as much as you can.
And would you say you have any examples of like property investing in terms of maybe a success story? Is there maybe like a failure story as such? Obviously, again, it's going to depend on what people class as success and what people class as failure. But would you have any examples that you could maybe share with people that, these are a success story, this is a failure?
Success one I can think of where there's a guy, actually, he is a property investor. He spent years at it. He's completely passionate about it. And he took on a property that he's very gutsy, actually. He took on a property that nobody would touch. You'd nearly think that it really should have just, the digger bucket should have went in, just tipped it over. But he went in, did his due diligence, had his guys in, he had the right sort of contractors in. They spotted the points, the problems, and they had the solutions, and they were able to get it at a good price. They went in, did all the work to it, spent a clean fortune to it, but he was able to stay on budget. And then he turned the house around and turned it into multiple apartments. And he did really, really, really well out of it. But that was simply down to probably a wee bit higher risk. He took on a higher risk, but he had strong knowledge. I suppose when you put the two together, it reduced that risk. Bad stories you come across, really it's down to people who jump in. There's one I can think of, jumped in, bought a property because it was cheap. I hate that phrase, cheap, and just buying something that's cheap. So they went into an area that had the known, it was high crime rate, a lot of loitering about, a lot of difficulties. Bought a property, thought this was great. Tenant went in. Basically after the first week, the tenant stopped paying rent, and it took over a year to get that tenant out through the legal process. And the amount of work and money that it cost to fix up the property afterwards was crazy.
And you made a good point there. Experience
Mm.
is probably key to property investing as such.
Yeah.
You know, if as you say, if you're diving head first in and maybe taking on more than what you've realized,
Mm-hmm.
that's obviously going to be a real detriment to you. Whereas, you know, would you be recommending sort of take baby steps first, build up a bit of knowledge and experience in property investing, and then as you move along, you can maybe get a slightly more gutsy because you've got the experience behind you.
Yeah. Like anything, whether you're taking on a new hobby or a new skill or whatever, find a mentor and find one or maybe two. A lot of people would go around and just ask everybody, and it's like a fireside lawyer. You ask 10 people and you get 10 different answers, but do they really have the experience?
Yeah.
They might have a bit of knowledge, but that's just knowledge they've heard from everybody else. You can't put a value on experience, people who have been in the trench and have learned and probably learned the hard way. So basically get a mentor on board and go and just, as you say, step by step.
So would you, well, I was going to ask any tips for investment or investors. That would probably be a good bit in terms of experience, and finding a mentor. Is there anything else that I've kind of missed? I know you did say that there was probably numerous things we could go in and touch on here. Like if we're going down a finance route, for example, are we still going to go and speak to a mortgage advisor, as normal?
Yeah. So still, yes, you go through, that's your team effectively. So you have your surveyor on board, you have your mortgage broker on board, and you have your property manager on board. So yes, you have to speak to a mortgage broker and basically work out how much is it going to cost you to borrow. Are there any setup fees? Are there any exit fees? Because again, you can't. Well, it's going to be more difficult, for instance, to get a mortgage if your plan is just simply to flip a house within 6 months, because you're going to have setup fees and exit fees. So yes, speak to everybody within your team effectively to make sure it all works out.
And I suppose then the other side of that as well is I was sitting thinking about if you are flipping a house, and you mentioned it earlier about budget. Clearly you could go in to look to renovate a property to flip it in 6 months' time, and you've got a budget. Is basically everything down to planning and having a financial plan in place? Because if that goes over budget, where do you sit with that property afterwards?
That's the that's the thing. I've been investing in property for years and have refurb properties, and you always have to put a contingency in there, and still there's always something just hits, you hit a snag of some sort, and it just costs you money. So that's why you have to have it all figured out.
Because I suppose probably me using a very loose term here is you bought a property for 100,000, you're hoping to sell it for 125, but you've now just spent 27 on refurbing it, so you've spent 127,000 and you're maybe only expected to get 125.
And there's legal fees to add in there for selling and buying, and so that's where you have to do your.
And then again, is there different ways for people to look at that? Could they maybe begin to rent that house out, say for example, for a year or 2 years, and then sell it afterwards because they've made slightly more money than renting it? Now they can flip it, and they've kind of made that wee bit of profit they were looking for.
Well, it's all about, without going into it, it's always advisable to have more than one exit strategy. So for instance, if your view is to just simply buy a house and flip it, you need to make sure that you have your figures stacked up and the work that you're going to do to it is all that it needs and that it's going to sell. But it is always advisable to reduce any risk to have maybe 2-3 exit strategies. So one of them would be, be prepared that you can just simply rent the property out, and the rent will maybe cover any costs on the basis that the property will rise in capital value, and then at a later date you exit by selling it.
So if we were doing a brief overview, plan.
Yep.
And make sure that you're speaking to the right people.
Yep.
Don't jump in.
And mentor. Get a mentor.
Yeah. And kind of ultimately just make sure that you've covered all bases.
Yeah. And then just a word of caution, like all investments, they can go up and can go down. So just don't expect to go into any sort of investment and think, oh, I'm going to make this amount of money. yes, you could make money. You could make money on one property, you lose in the next one. You're making, backwards and forwards, but always be prepared that you could lose your full investment.
Yeah, yeah. And I suppose that's maybe something that we should highlight, as the fact of, you are investing, every investment comes with a warning. Goes up, goes down, you could lose everything, or you could make a lot of money. You might hit a jackpot, you might hit bust, and it really just depends on how things go. So thank you very much, Roy. I think that finishes off for today. That's property investing, I suppose, in a nutshell.
Absolutely.
So thank you everyone for listening. We'll be back again in the next couple of weeks with another episode, and hopefully you will be here to tune in.
Thank you.